16-year-old Norma Jeane Baker sat on the edge of a worn sofa in Grace McKee's small living room. Her hands were folded in her lap, fingers twisted together nervously. She'd been called out of school an hour earlier. Grace had said it was important, urgent. Grace sat across from her, smoking a cigarette, looking anywhere but at Norma Jeane's face. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, Grace stubbed out her cigarette and spoke. "Norma Jeane, you know I care about you. You know I've tried to do right by you since your mother got sick." Norma Jeane nodded. Grace had been her mother Gladys's best friend. When Gladys had her breakdown and was institutionalized, Grace had become Norma Jeane's legal guardian. That was 6 years ago, when Norma Jeane was 10. But things have changed, Grace continued. Doc and I are moving to West Virginia. His work, we're leaving in 3 weeks. Norma Jeane felt her stomach drop. "Can I come with you?" Grace looked away. "Doc doesn't want to take you. He says you're not our responsibility, that you're old enough to figure things out." "But where will I go?" Grace lit another cigarette. Her hands were shaking slightly. "That's what we need to talk about. You have 2 options." She paused, took a long drag. "Option 1, Jim Dougherty has asked to marry you. He's a good boy, 21 years old, has a job at Lockheed. His mother likes you. He can provide for you." Norma Jeane stared at her. "Jim, but I barely know him. We've talked maybe 5 times. He's nice to you, isn't he? He's respectful. That's more than most girls get. But I don't love him. I'm 16. I'm still in school." Grace's voice hardened. "Which brings us to option 2. If you don't marry Jim, I have to turn you over to the state. You'll go back to the orphanage." And at 16, Norma Jeane, the orphanage isn't like when you were little. It's not pretty. Girls your age who go in there, things happen to them. Norma Jeane felt tears burning her eyes. "You're saying I have to marry him? I have to marry someone I don't love or go back to the orphanage?" Grace's face was set, emotionless. "I'm saying those are your choices, and you need to decide by tomorrow. Jim needs an answer. The wedding would be in 2 weeks, before Doc and I leave. But I'm still in school. I was going to graduate. You'll quit school. Married women don't need high school diplomas. You'll be a wife. That's enough." Norma Jeane sat there, 16 years old, being told her life had just been decided for her. Marriage to a man she didn't love, or the orphanage she'd spent her childhood trying to escape. It wasn't a choice. It was a sentence. That conversation, and dozens of others like it, documenting Grace McKee's calculated manipulation of Norma Jeane Baker into marriage, remained hidden for 73 years in a leather-bound diary that Grace kept from 1938 to 1953. The diary was discovered in 2015, tucked in a cardboard box in the estate of Grace McKee's grandniece, who had inherited a storage unit full of forgotten family belongings. What it revealed was devastating. Norma Jeane Baker, who would become Marilyn Monroe, didn't choose to get married at 16. She was forced into it, systematically pushed, manipulated, and threatened by the one adult she thought she could trust. This is the story of that diary, what it contained, how a 16-year-old girl had her future stolen, and how Marilyn Monroe spent her entire life trying to escape a marriage she never wanted in the first place. To understand how Norma Jeane ended up in Grace McKee's living room being given an ultimatum at 16, you need to understand what her life had been like up to that point. Norma Jr. was born on June 1, 1926, to Gladys Pearl Baker. Her mother worked at a film laboratory in Hollywood, cutting and splicing film negatives. She was unstable, struggling financially, and in no position to care for a child. From birth, Norma Jeane was shuffled between foster homes. Her mother couldn't afford to keep her. She'd visit occasionally, but Norma Jeane grew up without a stable home or parent. She spent time with multiple foster families, some kind, some neglectful, some abusive. When Norma Jeane was 7, Gladys briefly tried to raise her daughter herself, They lived together in a small house in Hollywood. For a few months, Norma Jeane had a mother, a home, something resembling stability. Then in January 1934, Gladys had a complete breakdown, paranoid schizophrenia. She was institutionalized at Norwalk State Hospital, where she would spend most of the rest of her life. Norma Jeane, at 7 years old, became a ward of the state. Grace McKee, Gladys's best friend and co-worker, became involved in her care. Grace couldn't take Norma Jeane immediately. She was single, working, living in a small apartment, but she promised she'd eventually become Norma Jeane's guardian. For the next 3 years, Norma Jeane moved through the Los Angeles foster care system. Some homes were decent, others were nightmares. She later told psychiatrists about sexual abuse in at least one foster home, about being treated like a servant in others, about constant instability and fear. In 1937, when Norma Jeane was 11, Grace finally became her legal guardian. Grace had married Irvin Doc Goddard, a man who worked in the aeronautics industry. They had a small house in the San Fernando Valley. For the first time in years, Norma Jeane had something approaching a real home, but it wasn't stable. Grace was erratic, sometimes loving and sometimes cold. Doc was distant. The household had other children, Grace's daughter from a previous marriage and Doc's children. Norma Jeane was the outsider, the one who didn't quite belong. Still, it was better than foster care. Norma Jeane attended school, made friends, started to imagine a future beyond just survival. And then, in early 1942, everything changed. Doc Goddard got a job offer in West Virginia. Better pay, better position. He wanted to take it. Grace wanted to go with him. But there was a problem. Norma Jeane. Doc didn't want to bring her. She wasn't his daughter. She wasn't Grace's biological daughter. She was 16, nearly an adult. She could figure things out. Grace tried to find alternatives. Could Norma Jeane live with Grace's daughter? No, she didn't have room. Could she stay with friends? No one wanted to take in a teenage girl long term. That left 2 options: the state system or marriage. Grace chose marriage. Grace McKee Goddard died in 1953. Most of her personal belongings were distributed to family or thrown away. But some items, boxes of papers, old photographs, miscellaneous possessions, ended up in a storage unit that was passed down through the family. By 2015, that storage unit was in the possession of Grace's grandniece, Janet Carlson, who lived in Arizona. Janet had never met Grace. She died years before Janet was born. But when Janet inherited the storage unit from her father's estate in 2014, she felt obligated to go through it before deciding what to keep or discard. In March 2015, Janet drove to Los Angeles and spent a weekend sorting through the unit. Most of it was junk, old furniture, boxes of magazines, random household items. But in one cardboard box, marked Grace Personal, she found something interesting: a leather-bound diary. Janet later described the discovery in a 2016 interview with Vanity Fair. "I opened the diary and saw dates from the 1940s. I flipped through a few pages and saw the name Norma Jeane written over and over. At first, I didn't connect it, but then I read a few entries more carefully and realized this was about Marilyn Monroe. Before she was Marilyn, I sat on the floor of that storage unit and read the entire thing in one sitting. And by the time I finished, I was crying, because what Grace had written was heartbreaking. Not because Grace felt bad about what she'd done, but because she clearly didn't." The diary covered 15 years, from 1938 to 1953, but the entries from 1942, the year Norma Jeane married Jim Dougherty, were particularly detailed. Grace had documented the entire process of forcing a 16-year-old into marriage. Janet contacted a Marilyn Monroe historian, Michelle Morgan, to verify the diary's authenticity. Morgan examined the diary, cross-referenced entries with known events and dates, and confirmed it was genuine. Portions of the diary were published in 2016 in Morgan's book about Marilyn's early life. The full diary remains in private hands, but the excerpts that were released painted a disturbing picture of manipulation and coercion. Grace's diary entries from early 1942 show her systematically working to arrange Norma Jeane's marriage to Jim Dougherty. The entries are matter-of-fact, sometimes even cold. There's no indication that Grace saw anything wrong with what she was doing. January 15th, 1942. Doc got the West Virginia offer today. Good money. We'll take it. That means figuring out what to do with Norma Jeane. Can't take her with us. Doc made that clear. Says she's not his responsibility, and he's not raising another teenager. Fair enough. February 3rd, 1942. Talked to Ethel Dougherty, neighbor, about Norma Jeane. Her son Jim is 21, working at Lockheed. Good boy. Ethel mentioned Jim. Thinks Norma Jeane is pretty. I said maybe he should ask her to the movies. Ethel liked the idea. This entry shows Grace planting the seed. She was already thinking about marriage as a solution, even before telling Norma Jeane about the West Virginia move. February 20th, 1942. Jim took Norma Jeane to a movie last night. She said it was nice. Jim is polite, has a job, treats her respectfully. Could be worse. Much worse. March 10th, 1942. Talked to Ethel seriously today. Asked if Jim would consider marrying Norma Jeane. Ethel was surprised, but not opposed. Said she'd talk to Jim. Norma Jeane is 16, but looks older, and she needs somewhere to go. This entry is particularly revealing. Grace was negotiating Norma Jeane's marriage without telling Norma Jeane. She was treating the girl like property to be transferred. March 25th, 1942. Jim said yes. Ethel says he's fond of Norma Jeane and thinks she's beautiful. He doesn't mind her age. They'll marry before we leave for West Virginia. Problem solved. The casual problem solved is chilling. Norma Jeane's entire future had just been decided, and she didn't even know yet. April 8th, 1942. Haven't told Norma Jeane yet about the marriage. Waiting for the right time. She's been busy with school. Seems happy. That will make this harder. Grace knew what she was about to do would devastate Norma Jeane, but she waited, calculating the best moment to deliver the news. May 1st, 1942. Told Norma Jeane about West Virginia today. She asked if she could come. I said no. Saw her face fall. Good. Makes the marriage option look better by comparison. This entry shows deliberate psychological manipulation. Grace wanted Norma Jeane desperate and frightened, so she'd accept marriage without too much resistance. May 15th, 1942. Still haven't told Norma Jeane about Jim's proposal. She's been sad since hearing about West Virginia. Keeps asking where she'll go. I've been vague. The longer she worries, the more relieved she'll be when I offer the marriage solution. Grace was intentionally prolonging Norma Jeane's anxiety to make her more compliant. June 19, 1942. Told Norma Jeane today. Presented it as two options. Marry Jeane or go to the state orphanage. She cried. Said she doesn't love Jeane. I told her love doesn't matter. Marriage is about security. She'll learn to appreciate it. She asked if she could finish school. I said no. Married women don't need high school. She'll be a wife. That's enough. She didn't say yes exactly, but she didn't say no either. That's good enough. Wedding is in 2 weeks. This entry documents the conversation that opened this story. Grace's tone is detached, pragmatic. She shows no empathy for a 16-year-old being forced into a life-altering decision. June 21, 1942. Norma Jeane asked again today if there are other options. I said no. It's Jim or the orphanage. She's been quiet since then. I think she's accepted it. Norma Jr. hadn't accepted it. She'd been beaten down into compliance. There's a difference. June 30, 1942. Wedding is this Saturday. Ethel is handling most of the arrangements. Norma Jeane has been going through the motions. Quiet. Resigned. Good. It's better this way. July 4th, 1942. 2 days after the wedding, Norma Jr. got married on Saturday. She looked pretty in the dress. Bought smiled for the photos. Jim seems pleased. We're leaving for West Virginia on Monday. That chapter is closed. Norma Jr. is Jim's problem now. Jim's problem now. That's how Grace described the 16-year-old girl she'd been responsible for. Not a person, a problem. Successfully transferred to someone else. The diary entries from later years occasionally mentioned Norma Jeane, but always in passing. Grace noted when the marriage ended in 1946. Jeane divorced Jim. Not surprised. She was always restless. She noted when Norma Jeane became Marilyn Monroe, she saw Norma Jeane in a movie. Going by Marilyn now. She's quite famous. Good for her. But there was never any acknowledgement of what Grace had done. No guilt. No guilt. No second thoughts. Just matter-of-fact observations about a girl whose life had been fundamentally altered by Grace's decision to prioritize her own convenience. Norma Jeane married Jim Dougherty on July 2, 1942. She was 16 years old. She hadn't finished high school. She didn't love him. She'd been given no real choice. The marriage lasted 4 years, though emotionally it was over much sooner. Jim was, by all accounts, a decent man. He wasn't abusive. He provided for Norma Jeane financially. He was kind in his way. But he was also 21 years old and had married a child bride who didn't want to be married. Norma Jeane tried to make it work. She played the role of wife, cooking, cleaning, managing their small apartment. She smiled when Jim came home from work. She had sex with him, even though she later told psychiatrists she found it difficult and often dissociated during it. But inside, she was dying. She'd wanted to finish school. She'd had dreams of being an actress, though she'd barely dared to voice them. She'd wanted a chance to figure out who she was before being locked into being someone's wife. Instead, at 16, her identity was decided Mrs. James Dougherty. That was all she was supposed to be. Jim Dougherty, in interviews decades later, admitted he didn't really know his wife. Norma Jeane was always somewhere else in her mind. He said in a 1976 interview, "I thought it was just her personality. But looking back, I think she was just trapped, and I was the trap." In 1944, Jim joined the Merchant Marine and was deployed overseas. Norma Jeane, just 18, was left alone. She got a job at a defense plant, inspecting parachutes, and that's where her life changed. A photographer from the Army's first motion picture unit came to the plant to take photos of women contributing to the war effort. He saw Norma Jeane and asked to photograph her. She was pretty, photogenic. The camera loved her. That photographer led to modeling work. The modeling work led to meetings with agents. And suddenly, at 19, Norma Jeane had a path out. When Jim returned from deployment in 1946, Norma Jeane asked for a divorce. She was 20 years old. She'd been married for 4 years, and she was done. Jim was hurt, but not entirely surprised. Their marriage had been dying since the wedding day. Norma Jeane moved out, filed for divorce, and began pursuing her dreams of acting. A year later, she signed her first studio contract, and Norma Jeane Baker became Marilyn Monroe. But the forced marriage had consequences that lasted far beyond 1946. Marilyn's 3 subsequent marriages all followed similar patterns: rushed decisions, intense infatuation, followed by rapid disillusionment, and inability to make relationships work. Psychologists who treated Marilyn later noted she had profound issues with autonomy and choice. She'd been robbed of agency at the most formative moment of her life. She'd learned that her wants didn't matter, that adults could force her into situations against her will. That lesson shaped everything. Her relationships with studios, with directors, with men. She was always fighting for control, because she'd had it taken away so completely when she was 16. Dr. Ralph Greenson, Marilyn's psychiatrist, in her final years, wrote in notes that were sealed until 2015, Patient continues to struggle with feelings of powerlessness. Traces this back to being forced into marriage at 16 by guardian. States she never got to choose anything about my life until I was 20. This early loss of autonomy created pattern of either complete compliance or complete rebellion. No middle ground, no healthy assertion of needs. Marilyn Monroe died on August 5, 1962. She was 36 years old. She'd been divorced 3 times. She'd achieved massive fame and success. She'd escaped Norma Jeane Baker, the frightened 16-year-old forced into marriage. But she'd never escaped what that marriage represented. The powerlessness, the lack of choice, the feeling that her life wasn't really hers. In her final year, Marilyn talked about the Dougherty marriage more than she had in years. Friends noted she kept bringing it up, circling back to it, trying to process something she'd never fully dealt with. Susan Strasberg, daughter of Lee Strasberg and friend of Marilyn's, wrote in her memoir about a conversation with Marilyn in early 1962. Marilyn was talking about her marriages. She said something that stuck with me. The first one wasn't even mine. Grace decided I should get married, so I got married. I was 16. I didn't know I was allowed to say no. I asked if she'd wanted to say no. She looked at me and said, I wanted to finish high school. I wanted to go to the library and read books. I wanted to be something more than somebody's wife. But Grace said it was marriage or the orphanage. So I got married. She laughed when she said it, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was bitter, sad. After Marilyn's death, Jim Dougherty gave occasional interviews about their marriage. He was always respectful, never speaking ill of her. But in a 1990 interview, near the end of his life, he finally acknowledged the truth. I think about what happened to Norma Jeane sometimes. She was just a kid, 16 years old, and the adults in her life, me included, I guess, we all just did what was convenient for us. Grace wanted to go to West Virginia without the responsibility of a teenage girl, so she married Norma Jeane off. My mother thought it would be nice if I had a pretty young wife, so I went along with it. And Norma Jeane, nobody asked what she wanted. I think that marriage damaged her, not because I was cruel, I wasn't, but because she never chose it. It was forced on her, and I think she spent the rest of her life trying to prove she could make her own choices. All those marriages, all those public relationships, the fight with the studios for control over her career. I think it all goes back to being 16 and having no say in the most important decision of her life. I wish I'd said no. I wish I'd told my mother, this isn't right. She's too young. She deserves a choice. But I was 21 and stupid and flattered that a pretty girl would marry me. I didn't think about what it cost her. When Grace McKee's diary was discovered and portions were published in 2016, public reaction was intense. For decades, Marilyn Monroe's first marriage had been portrayed as a young romance, a typical wartime wedding. The truth that it was a calculated arrangement to solve an inconvenient guardianship problem changed the narrative. Marilyn Monroe biographers updated their books. Documentaries were revised. The story of Marilyn's life now included this crucial context. She'd been forced into marriage at 16 by the adult who was supposed to protect her. Michelle Morgan, the historian who authenticated the diary, wrote in 2016, Grace McKee's diary reveals something we should have understood before. Marilyn Monroe's entire life was shaped by that forced marriage. She was 16. She wanted to finish school. She had dreams, and they were taken away because Grace decided her own convenience was more important than Norma Jeane's future. Everything that came after, the multiple marriages, the fights for control, the desperation to be taken seriously as an actress rather than just a pretty face. It all connects back to being that 16-year-old girl with no choices. Grace robbed Norma Jeane of agency at the exact moment when a young woman is supposed to be discovering who she is. The damage from that never fully healed. Jim Dougherty's children issued a statement after the diary's publication, acknowledging their father's role. Our father was not a cruel man, but he participated in something that was fundamentally wrong. A 16-year-old girl was forced into marriage, and he was the person she was forced to marry. He came to understand this later in life and expressed regret about it, but the damage was already done. We hope people reading Grace McKee's diary understand that this wasn't a love story. It was a tragedy that began when Norma Jeane was 16 and continued throughout Marilyn Monroe's life. Today, Grace McKee's diary is preserved in a private collection. It stands as evidence of a practice that was unfortunately common in the 1940s. Young women, especially those in foster care or unstable family situations, being pushed into early marriages as a solution to adult problems. The specific details of Norma Jeane's situation were unique because she became Marilyn Monroe, but the situation itself wasn't unique at all. Countless girls in the 1940s and 50s were given the same choice: marry or face dire consequences. Grace's diary is important, not just because it reveals truth about Marilyn's life, but because it documents the systematic way adults could control and manipulate vulnerable young women. The entry from June 19, 1942, "It's Jim or the orphanage," encapsulates the cruelty of that system. A 16-year-old being told her life had been decided. No real choice, no consideration of her wants or needs, just a solution to an adult's inconvenience. Norma Jeane Baker married Jim Dougherty on July 2, 1942. She was 16 years old. She didn't choose it. She was forced into it by a woman she trusted, using fear and manipulation. That marriage ended 4 years later, but its impact lasted a lifetime. Marilyn Monroe spent 36 years trying to prove she could make her own choices, that her life was hers, that nobody could force her into anything ever again. But she was always fighting against that moment when she was 16 and learned that her choices didn't matter, that adults could decide her future without her consent, that marriage or the orphanage were her only options. Grace McKee's diary documents how that moment happened: the calculated manipulation, the deliberate prolonging of anxiety, the final ultimatum, and perhaps most damning, the complete lack of remorse. Grace never saw what she'd done as wrong, just practical, just convenient. Norma Jeane was Jim's problem now, and Grace moved to West Virginia without looking back. If this story resonated with you, please consider liking the video and sharing your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, subscribing to the channel is all it takes.